I'm Nate Thompson, and I'm CEO and co-founder of Assessment Systems. And I'm originally a psychometrician, but what I like to do is develop software that makes it easier to do psychometrics, which includes integrating AI things like automated item generation, automated essay scoring, but also just providing a platform that makes it easier to go through the entire process from initial item writing all the way to online exam delivery, adaptive testing, item response theory, everything else.
Thanks, Nate. My name's Alan Mead, and welcome. I'm the chief psychometrician for Certiverse, and as a psychometrician, I do a lot of work that involves analysis, and I've always been interested, or have been interested for the past 10 years, in how we can apply analysis to steps of the exam development process prior to having the data. When we have the data, we've already had to have created the exam and administered it to a lot of people. And so that has been my entree and my interest in the area of AI. And so we took some questions that we have heard, and we broke them up into 3 sections, and we thought we'd start with these. And then if you have additional questions, we can weave those in. And the first are technical questions about large language models. The second is about candidate, and especially maybe candidate misbehavior. And then the third is about legal and ethical issues. And neither Nate nor I, we don't have a lawyer on the call, but we can give the psychometric perspective on legal and ethical issues. So one question that we have is, amounts to whether these large language models like GPT-3, ChatGPT, GPT-4, Bard are deterministic or not. So if 2 people generate an item, we're interested in generating exam content, and items is a common theme. Will they generate the same item with the same input? Please excuse me. And the answer is that the models are not deterministic unless you tell them to be. The models contain a parameter called temperature, like the outside temperature that's getting warmer in the spring here in Chicago. And if you set that to 0, then the technical outcome of that is that the system will always pick the most likely next token. The practical outcome of that is that it will always produce the same output for exactly the same input. But usually you use these models with a temperature that's higher, and then in that case, the models can definitely produce different results. In my experience in using these models, there are prompts that produce very similar responses each time you provide them, even if the temperature is high. And then there are other prompts, and I think probably many more prompts, that will generate fairly different responses. And so part of the issue would be picking prompts. So choosing how to use the models and giving it instructions in a way that gives it more leeway to if you want the model to produce different results for different people, to use the model in a way that encourages that. Nate, do you have anything to add to that?
Sure. Yeah. Also, just that it's going to continue to grow as like we get into the next question. As we get a new version of ChatGPT, the corpus is going to grow, and it's going to produce new results off in the future, even if it was giving the same previously. It's also important to consider the size of the portion of the corpus for the topic that you're talking about. I've asked ChatGPT several times to write questions on item response theory. The corpus on item response theory is relatively small compared to other areas, so the results are pretty similar each time. Whereas I also asked it to write questions on bookkeeping for a bookkeeping exam, just as a comparison, because that's a pretty broad thing, and there's lots of corpus out there on it, and the results were more different than the IRT questions.
Yeah, that's a good point about the corpus. And the question about the data that was used to train the model, that's pretty simple, because for ChatGPT-3, there was a tech report that kind of described the data. There was a lot of data from the web, especially like Reddit. They picked responses that had been upvoted by Redditors, and they had a significant portion of the data set that was based on something called books, and a significant portion that was based on just crawling the web in general. So it was a lot of information from the internet, and a large portion of it, but not all of it, was in English. They have not been nearly, not that that details every datum that went into the model, but they haven't been nearly as forthcoming with how they gathered the data for GPT-4. So that's an open question. But the data the model was trained on was, you could think of it like in extremely imprecise terms, like the internet. And so, for example, if there's data that's not on the internet or that you hope is not on the internet, like your proprietary training materials, then presumably that is not part of the model. It's also true that the data cuts off at a certain point. So, for example, I think the cutoff point for GPT-3 was 2019. So it wouldn't know about anything after 2019. And I think GPT-4 is more recent. I think its cutoff is in 2021. But it definitely wouldn't know about something that happened last week. And Nate's point about the type of data that's more common will definitely, the model will have more ability. I think it's pretty amazing that the model can generate items based on IRT or psychometrics. That can't be a very big part of the internet, and yet the model is able to generate items like that.
Yeah, and pretty decent ones.
So the next question we have, and I get this a lot, is can these models return my proprietary information? And I hope from the answer to the previous question, it's clear that they will not automatically, unless your information somehow got leaked onto the internet, they definitely won't automatically incorporate your information. And one of the things that may not be perfectly apparent is that these models, an enormous cost went into training them. And so if your proprietary information wasn't part of that, there is no way that I know of adding that or asking it to add that information. Chat GPT, which is GPT 3.5, has a plugin that allows it to search the web. And my understanding of how that works is that it can go out and find information. And I guess it's conceivable through that mechanism that you could have it essentially browse your website and return information that's similar to an item. So that might be possible. But the model you can't add any information in that sense to the model. There was a mechanism for fine-tuning the model, and that's not impossible, but that might be another way that you might have to do it. Or you might have to create your own model either on top of GPT or separate from it in order to incorporate your proprietary information.
Yeah, that's a good point about how you can't just upload your own company handbook and write questions about it or something like that, because it's going to say, we're trained on this existing corpus, which you described before, and anything's going to be based off of that, especially if it's 2-3 years old or so on. So it's not going to fill that hole in the world of item development. And I even tried it once, and I gave it some content I had written on IRT and said, hey, can you write me questions off of this? And it specifically replied, I'm trained on a large language model based on another corpus. I will write you other questions based upon what I have learned about item response theory elsewhere in the corpus, but I can't reply or write directly off what you have submitted. It gave that in its response.
Yeah, they're trained increasingly to be polite and to evidence their weaknesses.
Yes, exactly. They don't want people to over rely, which I'm glad that they're doing that.
And all of the things that we've talked about so far are true of any large language model. OpenAI is a company that provides the models that most people have heard of and most people have used. But for example, Google made Bard available, and there are definitely other large language models that are potentially available. And so the last question on this slide is, will the OpenAI use my data? And I guess people are specifically worried about, if they were to do something like Nate just said, here's an item I wrote, please write another item like it. Does that mean that their item they input into the prompt will show up in the model? And for OpenAI, they've been very clear that if you use a computer connection called an API, they will not be using that data. And I think we could see the terms of use dictate what they might use and not use. I think they decided recently that they would stop using, but you should check the terms of the use on their website because it could change. That they'll stop using the inputs as that you put in as part of the model, and that would only be a concern for future versions of the model at any rate, because returning to my original point, they spent millions of dollars training this model. So the model is not learning. I don't want to say it's not learning anything, but it's definitely not learning from each of the questions that you input. They might still be doing some types of refinement of the model, but probably that's by paying people to look at the model and its output and deciding whether the output is good or could be better. And that's probably how they would use the output. They wouldn't actually use your items as part of the training data set. They collected the training data set and used the training data set a long time ago, and they're not going to reopen that. I guess the fear would be that it might be part of a future data set for GPT-5 or something like that. So that's true for OpenAI. They will abide by their terms of use, and you can refer to those and decide whether that's acceptable. But in general, I wouldn't be too worried about your items ending up in the model. Another similar concern that people have is that the item might be memorized exactly, and that might be spit back at a later time. And that isn't really how the model works. The model learns connections between words and then produces a response by leveraging that knowledge about how words go together with attention to the prompt. And so it isn't likely to memorize your item directly. There are instances where researchers have found that large language models can memorize pieces of the input training data and repeat it back. But those are instances where, because of the way the data was scraped together, you collected the same data over and over again. I believe, if I remember correctly, the instance that I was reading about in a research paper, the piece of it was like a poem or something like that, and the poem had been replicated in the training data set something like 14,000 times. And so if you put the same poem into the training data set 14,000 times, and you create a prompt that tickles the model to output something like that, it could produce that poem directly. But that's the circumstances in which it would memorize a piece of text and repeat it back verbatim.
Yeah, and that's a good counterexample of why it's in the best interest of OpenAI to control what's being integrated into their corpus and not just take in anything that everyone submits, because somebody could game it by using the API and submitting the same thing 14,000 times and thereby push OpenAI's algorithm in the direction they want to go.
But that's definitely not happening because they're not using that data for training.
Exactly. They want to protect it and then have their humans do reinforcement learning in terms of what's good to keep using or what's not.
Can I just drop in for 1 second, because we had a question just to clarify the use of corpus. So is corpus and body of knowledge the same thing?
Yes, data set. A corpus is a collection of documents in machine learning. So it's the when we talk about the training data set, corpus is a synonym for that. Are there any other technical questions, or should we move on to candidate misbehavior?
There's a couple more. Should we talk to those, Andrea, before we move on?
Sure, we can go ahead and hit this while it's topical. One was also, does the model become recursive if it keeps training on its own output?
Does the model become recursive? I guess that the end goal is to have the model be like humans in its understanding of the material and its ability to generate text. So if humans are recursive, then yes, and if humans aren't recursive, then no. The models are called autoregressive, but that refers to the specific way that they attend to the words. So I don't think that's what you mean by recursive. But that's the nature of the model that allows it to generate nice responses that are associated with the prompt.
Yeah, and I don't think it totally trains on its own outputs, especially because they do have teams of humans gauging the output of OpenAI in terms of what's good and what should be taken out, right, Alan?
Oh, in that case, in that sense, it's not recursive. I'm not aware of any use of where they take the model output and use it to train the model. One reason why is because of the chicken and egg problem, right? You don't have the model to produce output. But what Nate is talking about, the human reinforcement learning from human feedback, is is one of the pieces of sort of secret sauce that make these models a little bit better than competitors, or maybe a lot better than competitors, where they've taken the output or many outputs, and a human has sorted through that. They've paid humans to spend a very long time, like the rumors are a person decade was input into this process for GPT-3, and they say, oh yeah, this is a better way to do it, and then they train the model to produce better output that's more useful to humans. So that's a little bit recursive, but the model doesn't have the data to train itself, and I don't think they do that with successive versions. GPT-4 is not trained on the output of GPT-3. Is that strictly true? There are some mechanisms within machine learning where you do something like that to fuzz the input, but I don't think that, and I'm not aware that that's a significant portion of the training of these models.
Okay, I think the other questions we have are more related to exam development, so we can get to those a little bit later as well.
Okay. So one question we have is, if I used AI to generate content, what's to stop someone else from putting the exact same prompt in and getting back the exact same results? And it speaks to that first question that we addressed. If the temperature is set to 0 and you put exactly the same input, you will get exactly the same output. Also, if your prompt is very, very narrow, then you're likely to get some similar output. So it is true that you should be concerned that if you were to publicize the inputs, and the inputs were very, very specific, that you might have concern that somebody could reverse engineer your exam. That said, I feel strongly myself that those inputs should be devised by subject matter experts, and that they should be similar to creating an item. And I'm talking about, creating exam content like items in my response. So I think that without AI assistance, a subject matter expert has to decide, oh, I have to write a question about this topic. Here's my idea for the question. And then they devise, perhaps a scenario and a STEM, and then they devise a correct answer, and then devise incorrect answers. Well, I'd like to take the idea for the item and have them input that into the model as the prompt, in addition to other information, like it should be about this, it should be about bookkeeping, and it should be about balancing a spreadsheet or balancing a balance sheet within bookkeeping, and have the subject matter expert write that. And I think that if you were to divulge that information about an exam that wasn't generated by AI, you'd have exactly the same concerns that a person could, regenerate your exam. I guess the AI would help that person regenerate the exam in that case. So I think that's kind of a narrow circumstance to be concerned about, that you should treat the item content as confidential, just like you do today, if you're using AI assistance. Nate, do you have anything to add or disagree?
No, I don't disagree. Like you said, the temperature is going to control that, but also, like I mentioned earlier, the size of the corpus on a given topic is going to do a lot too. If you're going to, try to write 100 questions about item response theory, and the corpus on that's pretty narrow, the 100 questions are probably going to be pretty similar if you do it twice, even if the temperature is higher. Whereas if you're doing something large like American Revolutionary War or something, it's probably going to be more variation that's going to happen in your output of the questions that are being generated.
And I wouldn't advocate that you just ask it to write a question about IRT. I would, within IRT, there are various topics like fitting models, or choosing between different models, or assumptions, or the assumption of unidimensionality. And I think that I'd probably give it a more specific topic that's related to my blueprint. And then I would want the subject matter experts to give even more specific ideas about, for example, within the topic of assumptions of the IRT model, I'd like them to say something like, how do you test the dimensionality, or what is the effect of multidimensionality on the model, or that you get pretty specific. And I think that generates variance. The model will listen to that specificity often, and it will usually create different kinds of items based on different kinds of input.
Yeah.
Nate, what would you do to stop a candidate from cheating using AI?
Well, certainly a lockdown browser goes a long way into this, because somebody could still cheat using it by using a different device, by pulling up OpenAI on their phone or their tablet while they're taking a test on their laptop. But that's certainly going to slow them down a ton, because then they're going to have to try to type in questions on their phone with their thumbs, when their response times are then going to show up appropriately on their test. So there's certainly going to be a signature in that respect, if they're using AI. If it's a unproctored test, yeah, it's going to be hard to control something like that, or an unlockdown test. One of my clients had already asked about it, saying, we give tests without lockdown browsers. What's to stop somebody from having another tab open and just pulling in responses from there? Or even if it's multiple choice questions, you can just copy the multiple choice question, paste it into ChatGPT, and ask what's the answer. And the responses you'd be getting that would be about as fast as you would as a human response if you know the answer, really. And there'd be no way to catch it that. So you really have to have that lockdown browser and remote proctoring. But I see, as we talk about AI in general, the cost of lockdown browsers and AI remote proctoring is going to come down substantially over time as well, because that's going to be so much cheaper to do too. Now that, Amazon really has facial detection algorithms that you can use for essentially for free, similar cost that we have to ChatGPT. So it's the cost of having AI proctoring is going to combat the cost of having ChatGPT as a cheater.
Using fire to fight fire.
Yeah.
It's definitely true, though, that this technology will make it easier to get answers, or at least that's what big search engine firms are hoping for. And so if a person does have access to this technology, it could help them. I guess the other way to interpret this question is similar to the first question. What's to stop a candidate from taking your blueprint and reverse engineering it to a set of practice questions? And I think that that's actually a strategy they could do. I think they could do that today. They could just look at your blueprint. This would just make it easier for them, in the same way that it makes it easier for exam programs to create exam content. And again, the specificities which you provide the information about the content of the items of the exam is probably important. If you just have the topics that they have to learn, that's not probably specific enough to generate content that's very similar to the exam content. But if you told them all the specific prompts, which would be a terrible idea for today without AI or tomorrow with AI, then I think that a candidate could generate a practice exam. I'm not sure if that by itself is the end of the world. I'm more worried about people, but I'll leave that worry to you. I'm more worried about people literally, Googling the answer or ChatGPTing the answer. How can we detect AI in candidate responses?
There's certainly some research that's going out on this. Some of it saying it's really not that much more than a coin flip as ChatGPT becomes smarter. Some of the early research I saw on it was looking for things that are really more human in terms. One was looking at for punchiness. If you look at a text passage being written by ChatGPT, it's fairly even. Every sentence has like 10 words, and it uses transition words appropriately fairly often, that sort of thing. And that's just not the way that a human talks, especially like a 16-year-old that using slang that's trying to write a essay. It's going to come across totally different than what ChatGPT would. On the other hand, ChatGPT is being trained on things like Reddit, like you said. And over time, it's going to become smarter. And you could tell somebody, hey, I can see it write me an essay from the perspective of a 16-year-old high school student about whether there should be sports in my school, because that's the essay that they're supposed to write. And it will be more punchy. It will use more interjections. It will use more slang because it's read, millions of pages on Reddit that uses slang. And that's going to be a lot tougher, I think, in the future to make that difference.
Yeah, I think that it will be tough to tell the difference between a well-edited AI response and something that a person wrote from scratch. And in some cases, it'll be difficult to detect. I think AI varies in its quality, and I think some of the responses unedited might be quite good. But there are some, like the AI tends to be redundant in some cases and have other idiosyncrasies that I think that sometimes unedited text can be detected. So I think that that's going to be harder. And going back to proctoring, I think that proctoring or knowing where it came from would be good. I think that that educators are thinking about ways that they can write prompts that are a little less likely to be answered well by AI. And I think that's something to give some thought to. Today, you can leverage the cutoff date. So you can ask about a recent event that it wouldn't directly know about. And that wouldn't prevent it from producing a response, but it might not produce as good a response. And the student would have to know and edit the response to put more content in.
Yeah, that's a very good point.
So that's what we have. Those are the pre-generated questions about candidate misbehavior. Do we have any questions in the chat that we should address before we move on to legal and ethical topics?
Not specifically to nefariousness.
Okay. So actually, before I start this, let me just say that neither Nate, I guess I already said this, neither Nate nor I are lawyers. We can't give legal advice. So we'll be describing our perspective as psychometricians, and you should get legal advice from your lawyer. And I do get the question whether you can copyright the output of an AI model. And OpenAI has been perfectly clear that they will not assert responses from the model that are generated from the API. So if you have software that calls the model and you're using OpenAI's models, you can consult the terms of use or the terms and conditions, and they will not assert copyright. But there was a case where the office that issues copyrights, an artist tried to copyright an image, and part of his artistry was that the image was entirely created by an AI, and he was trying to register a copyright for that image, and that office declined to register that copyright. They said that they only register things that have substantial. They have some wording, but I would describe it as substantial human input. And since that part of the artistry of that was that an algorithm created it without human input, that they would not register that copyright. And then subsequently, I don't know if it was the same artist or a different artist, did a similar thing. They created a comic book where each of the images was generated by an algorithm. And the ruling on that was that the comic book could be, that a copyright on the comic book could be registered, but that they wouldn't register a copyright on each individual image. So I guess the concern from a legal standpoint is that you might have difficulty registering a copyright if an algorithm generated items for your exam, but you would be able to register a copyright, presumably, on the exam itself as a collection of items. So again, that really seems like something that a lawyer should address. And I also think it's probably an area, like the reason why this came up is because of the rise of these models. And I think we're still in early days. I'm not sure that that's the definitive result. I guess as a non-lawyer, I'm extremely curious to know what represents substantial human input. In the guidance that this office produced, the Copyright and Patent Office, I think is what it's called, they had an example of if you had an image and you modified it using something like Photoshop, that definitely wouldn't cause that image to be uncopyrightable because you use Photoshop. but that they do expect that the human producer has to have substantial input to the, I forget what their wording they use, the style and the contents. And so I don't know if you have subject matter experts provide the idea for the item, and then you have them perhaps, take the output. And by the way, we haven't talked much about some of the results that we talked about in the last webinar, but my research suggests that if the current models will all require SME editing, so that they're not going to be good enough in general to use unedited. And so it's an open question in my mind whether that's a substantial human input or whether it won't. And I'm not sure that that's a settled legal question, but a lawyer could give you a better perspective on that. The other question, stepping back, is I'm sure there are exam programs that register a copyright for their individual items or for their exams, but I'm also sure there are programs that don't. And so both because they like, I can see why that would be scary for a lawyer, but I'm not sure how many exam programs that will actually directly affect. I'm sure there's some that for whom that's a significant stumbling block. But I know of exam programs that say, well, the content changes so fast, I have to revise the exam every year. And so I don't bother trying to register the copyright. I just write new items, over the course of a year or every time the software changes. So I think, that's an interesting point, which could have some sharp edges, and which, you should be aware of those, and you should get legal advice for if that's of concern to you. Nate, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, your point about what is, essentially human input or human creativity, at what level that comes into play is really what's at the crux of this issue for me. Because what if AI writes a question and it's completely off base and a human comes in and replaces 2 of the answers on the multiple choice? Is it then human written or is it then AI written? Is it copyrightable in that case? Or same with editing a reading passage. I mean, in some cases, you're going to have to totally edit a reading passage. And I think that question applies to other things too. Like if somebody takes a picture in a public place, if a reporter takes a photograph in a public place, all they're doing is clicking a button on their digital camera, but really they get copyright off of that as well too. But it's the machine that's doing all of the work. It's taking the light and turning it into pixels and storing it as a digital file. It's doing all of the work. Not very much different than AI generating an image, really.
I agree. I think that before that ruling, I would have expected that whoever created the software could exert copyright over the output of the software.
Yeah.
I think about websites like Zillow or Amazon. They don't hand generate each of those pages. A computer algorithm generates them, and yet I'm sure that they're able to, exert copyright over those pages. But that might be seen quite differently because they might see it as a template. So raises questions about, I think the goal of automatic item generation is to create items without human input and to have them be ready to be used with test takers in the moment, on the fly. And I guess this copyright ruling makes me wonder whether those items can ever be copyrighted. Maybe if you can generate a unique item every time you use it, you don't care, because you're never going to try and copyright every item.
Yeah, if you're throwing it away, especially those programs, like you said, that are making a new exam every 6 months because the content's changing.
Do you think it's ethical to use GPT 3.5, Nate?
Yeah, absolutely, especially if there's a human reviewing it, because we know that there are certainly some issues for that. And human reviewing a human item or human reviewing an AI written item, it's still going to get you to the same place as long as it was an expert, subject matter experts that's been approved and set up by the certification committee or whoever's in charge for approving what's going on in an exam.
I think an ethical use is, I think we're, generating exam content, we're a lot less likely to touch upon some of the concerns that people have about ethical use. For example, there's concern that if you hoovered up a bunch of information on the internet, that your personal information could be part of it. But I've never seen anything come out of the model for exams that seem like personal information. So I just think that we're a lot less likely to touch some of the lightning rods. And the other thing I'd say about ethics is my view of ethics is that it's a matter of thinking about the ramifications of what you're doing. So, for example, if somebody's content was used in training the model, then is your use of the model to generate items, is that going to harm them, or is that going to harm their ability to sell that information, or anything like that?
Yeah.
And
Or is it going to make the assessment better?
yeah, and so I just think that in our constrained use, there's probably fewer ethical issues. But on the other hand, I don't think you could say that, oh yeah, all uses of GPT 3.5 are ethical. I think it really has to depend on an evaluation of the use. And I think that it's good that we're having a discussion about that. But I just think that a lot of the concerns are less likely to impinge upon our use in generating content.
Yeah, and that's a good point about some of those, pre-using personal information and other aspects. Things like we use Reddit. What if somebody trains AI models on whitepages.com and Zoom Info and all those other websites that distribute people's personal information, even if it's quote unquote public personal information? I'm curious what the copyright on that is.
Yeah, there might be circumstances where you might be worried about that. If you're generating case studies, for example, or something like that, I guess it's conceivable that that the model could choose. I'll bet the model has a tendency to create names like John Smith a lot too. So probably there are common combinations and it's more likely to produce, but that's because it's seen those combinations more often.
Yeah.
This last question I slipped in because there's some legislation in New York City that is causing a stir in some quarters, and you may or may not have heard about this, but that legislation, the answer to the question is what's considered AI for legal purposes has no answer. Every legislator or regulator could conceivably consider AI in different ways. But the notable thing about the New York City legislation is that I think on purpose, I think very much on purpose, they've construed they don't call it AI, but they call it automation or something like that, or algorithms. They've construed that extremely broadly, so that it would cover just about all use of testing. But maybe that's overly broad. But it would certainly potentially cover uses that we would never consider AI, like using a regression model to combine tests to rank order candidates and select from the top down. I think that would be covered under the New York City law as AI. And my understanding is that ATP recently convinced EU regulators not to be so broad in their regulations. They created another class of assessment that would incorporate automated scoring, like we automatically score all computerized tests, that wouldn't consider it AI. But I think the legislators in New York City purposefully made that legislation more broad, and the consequences of that are that either you need to avoid using those and rely on humans to make decisions like interviews, or you need to the law actually requires that you publish a bias audit. And by the way, I think that auditing AI for bias is not a bad thing. I'm not sure that that law will have good consequences, but I think that we should be concerned about the potential for AI that is answering things algorithmically to have bias. And I think that psychologists have good tools for auditing those algorithms for bias. So I don't think that aspect is actually a bad outcome. Do you have anything to add about that, Nate?
Yeah, I certainly agree that you have to be careful about what is the level of broadness you go with there too, like, being able to subject, simple regression analyses to combine scores for predictive usage. or using linear on the fly testing and adaptive testing qualify as AI using machine learning models under a lot of definitions as well too? Do those then fall under AI and have to be defended with those types of legal situations, which I think that's crazy. Or other
So
things, having a simple AI algorithm to read through piles of resumes to pull up people that meet certain educational requirements. You have to have a bachelor's degree to apply for this job. And you don't want to have a human read through 10,000 resumes, so you have an AI do that. Well, it's a pretty simple thing, but it's still AI. And is that going to get challenged?
I think if that's a good question, and I guess the key point of all these answers is that we have no idea what legislators are going to decide about what constitutes AI and how they're going to regulate it. So I do think we're going to see additional scrutiny and interest from regulators about the use of AI in a variety of circumstances. Andre, do we have other questions? I'm cognizant that we've got about 15 minutes left.
We do. Well, in this area as well, I think a quick one is just what area of law it would fall under. Like we keep saying, we're not lawyers. What type of lawyer should someone be talking with? I think my initial instinct would be that, to look out for a copyright lawyer, but is there another thought or suggestion that you would have?
I think ask a lawyer. I think I do think that copyright law is probably what most people are worried about today in the context of registering copyright for AI output, or what the best strategy is. But the lawyers that would probably be concerned with the New York City legislation are probably labor attorneys who are familiar with civil rights legislation and defending their clients from biased lawsuits. So I think it could probably touch upon a number of things. Hopefully not criminal defense anytime soon.
Yes. Yeah, at this point, it's more intellectual property and copyright. But you're right. I think those labor lawyers are going to come in at it from a different perspective, and they're not intellectual property type lawyers.
Other questions?
It was also asked if we should have to disclose that AI was used in creating test items or exam content.
Oofta.
Some people believe it's a best practice to do that, and I don't think there's anything wrong with doing that in most circumstances. But I think that the ethical considerations that lead to that recommendation are when you're providing the output directly to a person in a way that they might be confused or not understand. And I think it's partially because of the lack of perfection in the output, the possibility of the output saying inappropriate things or being inappropriate, and therefore warning people. For example, if you use these models to summarize a Reddit conversation, then you publish that on your news site, and it's entirely generated by these models. I think in that circumstance, I would feel like it's more important to acknowledge that you automatically generate this content from, whatever, from Reddit or from original content.
Yeah, I think so too. If you think about it, a lot of organizations do publish information about how their exams are developed. A certification board will say, here's our job analysis report. Here's our Angoff report. Here's our item writing guidelines that we use. Here's the references we use to write our items, these textbooks, that sort of thing. And I can see it going the direction of, disclosing that we use ChatGPT is another one of those pieces of documentation that's released. Say what exactly was done, but it's part of that whole documentation piece.
And I think it's important that, you shoot for substantial human input from the standpoint of, a human expert has reviewed everything and we're sure that everything is correct. And I think that's an important statement to make if you do use a large language model. Or if you're going to be using it without that protection, I think that's probably important to disclose. I did a study. I did a study once about AIG, and I specifically introduced errors into the items just to see what the candidate reaction would be. And candidates tend to try and make sense of your items. So, for example, if there are two correct answers, they didn't get bent out of shape. They just picked the first answer they came across. So actually, I have a little tiny bit of research that suggests that people are um, pretty immune to the concerns you might have about the imperfections in generating items. But I still think it's much better to have subject matter experts review everything and be sure that it's all correct and that there aren't two correct answers. Anything like that.
And are we to the kind of general other questions that we want to cover?
Yes.
Maria? Okay, great. So then I will do those in chronological order as we got them through the presentation. So the first being, and I think this is kind of just a big question that we didn't specifically cover, but maybe in some more pieces we did. But what do you think is the most beneficial application of AI in assessment development and monitoring? And what are those that you feel are not worth the effort or downsides?
Nate, do you have an answer?
I think historically it has been with AI proctoring has been the most useful, especially during COVID that really saw a huge explosion in usage. But now I see it more moving towards content generation because that is a huge cost load on a lot of assessment organizations, and ChatGPT will directly assess it.
My answer would be these models do two things. They generate text according to that's related to a prompt. And also, this is less apparent, they have a methodology for determining which two things are alike, which I think is how they answer exam questions. Like, you know, in the tech report, you might, or in the news, you might have seen that the latest ChatGPT-4, you know, passed the bar exam. I think that they leverage this, you know, which of these goes with the others to identify the correct answer. But so those are the two things that it does well. One thing that it doesn't do well is provide factual answers. So I think that it is a good assistive technology, and it's better where you're creating something that's similar. So for example, if you're generating an item, I think it's really good at creating a scenario that's similar to a prompt. And I think it can create a question that's similar to the scenario, although it has a little trouble with that sometimes. And I think it can create answers that are related to that. But I'm not sure that it's great at knowing for sure that the correct answer is correct and that the incorrect answers are incorrect. Or we've had it generate rationales, and I'm not sure that it's always great. It can definitely generate great rationales, but sometimes the rationale it generates is impoverished and not as helpful. So, and I think that it directly addresses the whether it's a truth teller, and these models are not truth tellers; they're storytellers. They can generate text that's similar to other text very well, but knowing that it's correct in the sense that we use the word correct is very hard for these models.
All right. And what are your thoughts about using ChatGPT to measure item difficulty? It said that they read that ChatGPT used NLP, and curious if you see this as a valid instrument to try and create more objective evaluation of item difficulty than the subjectivity of SMEs.
Oh, I made a post when ChatGPT first came out in jest, in sarcasm, saying that we were just going to feed questions to ChatGPT and it was going to pilot them for us by taking it over and over and estimating difficulty. And boy, did I get some angry feedback from some psychometricians who didn't realize that I was being sarcastic. And so I don't think we're going down that direction anytime soon.
I think it's hard to predict the difficulty from, I don't want to say that it's impossible. And I think you'd have to do a domain specific study where you fine tune the model to produce, you know, so for example, within a domain, there might be words that are related to difficulty. But I think that that's not likely to be a good, when we've tried to predict the difficulty of items, the best predictor is a subject matter expert giving you an estimate. And the second best predictor is the content area. And the third best predictor is the readability. So when I consider how well GPT-3 or GPT-4 can stand in for one of those, maybe it can talk about the readability, but and maybe you could train it to know about the content, but I don't think that you will have a great outcome, a high R-squared predicting the difficulty.
Yep.
Gotcha. And then we also had a question about how might AI be used to score or give feedback on student essays? And are there privacy concerns if a student's essay is submitted for feedback?
Well, you could, I think you'd have to, the models work by you telling them what to do and them generating text. So for example, you can, one thing that the OpenAI models do fairly well is to summarize. And so you could ask you'd have to devise prompts that evaluate specific aspects of the writing, and you might have to fine tune it. The way that, well, maybe I should let Nate talk about automated essay scoring, but that operates a little differently.
Yeah, because automated essay scoring is a very specific application of AI. It's not using ChatGPT, it's fitting custom machine learning models. And in those cases, you certainly could fit the machine learning model to give certain types of feedback. I graded essays when I was in grad school. I read the same essay thousands of times about asking kids to write a letter to their school board about whether there should be sports in schools, and you had to give an intro paragraph, an outro paragraph, and 3 supporting reasons why. And it would be relatively simple to make a AI algorithm to count that those 4 or 5 things existed and provide feedback onto your argument structure in that case. There are other cases where it becomes harder to do. In those cases, it can be more general, like grading people on grammar or voice or something like that. Those can then use more open AI models, but a lot of AI essay scoring is very, very narrow.
And it has to be trained for that purpose. It's not the large language models are generalists.
Yep.
And those the usual AI that we use for scoring something like an essay is very specific.
Great. Those are all the specific questions we have, but we might have one kind of good parting comment that I think could generate some thought, and that is that it seems that trying to outsmart AI is going to be very difficult, so we need to adjust our approach to modes where AI is less directly useful. There's your thoughts there.
Yeah, I think that one of the things we didn't address is, oh gosh, this AI can write a response to my chat, or it can chat with me, and so isn't it, can it do everything? The answer is definitely no. There's a lot of over hype about these models, and so I think it's important to evaluate it for a particular use case, and to see how well it does. And I think that we'll find that can be useful if we think about it the right way, but it can't just do everything. Nate, do you want to take the last 3 minutes?
Sure. Yeah, it's just agree that it's really a generalist. It does certain things very well. Like you said in the first presentation, it's a storyteller. And there are applications of AI to solving very specific problems, but they're going to be custom designed, like the automated essay scoring. Our AI remote proctoring, it's not like they're using some general AI to do AI proctoring. They have specifically trained image recognition algorithms to look for black rectangles this shape and look for faces and other things that are very specific. And that AI is still going to continue to grow, but it's going to be for narrow, specific fields like that.
Great.
Well, thank you all very much.
Yeah, indeed. Thanks everybody for joining us today. If anything came up that you would like a little more information about, or there was maybe something that was a little mysterious, you can go back and check out the first kind of more specific science-based webinar that we did on AI and assessment. That is on Certiverse.com and also our YouTube channel. I'm sure Nate has posted it as well through his channels.